Vaelora Marn was no ordinary mother. Behind her cold, distant eyes hid secrets too dark for even the most seasoned detectives to imagine. Her children, Sereth, Aria, Myla, Zakay, Brune, and Nirel, were not just her family. They were her subjects, trapped in a twisted world of silence, suffering, and ritual. When police finally stepped inside the Marn residence, they weren't prepared to uncover a house of horrors, designed not for living, but for worshipping something far more sinister than anyone could comprehend. In the quiet outskirts of Renslow, a small forest-lined town hidden deep within Oregon's thick wilderness, life moved at a gentle, predictable pace. Residents mostly kept to themselves, and news rarely strayed beyond weather changes or the occasional bear sighting. So, when a local school administrator filed a report about a missing child, there was a ripple of unease, small, but enough to stir whispers among neighbours. The missing girl's name was Vaelora Marn. She was only 9 years old and hadn't been seen in nearly 3 weeks. It wasn't just her absence that raised concern, it was the silence that followed it. Vaelora's school had reached out several times. First, it was a polite letter, then follow-up phone calls, and finally a home visit by a school counsellor. Each attempt ended the same way: unanswered calls, locked gates, and silence behind tightly drawn curtains. The house she lived in was tucked behind an overgrown yard, its wooden fence leaning from years of neglect. Most of the neighbours didn't know much about the family. They had only seen the mother, Vaelora Marn, on rare occasions. She was always alone, cloaked in long black robes, her eyes fixed downward, her steps fast and deliberate. The children, it seemed, were kept out of sight. When Officer Rakim Silas received the welfare request from the school district, it seemed like a routine check. These calls usually led to nothing more than families who had moved without notice, or children being homeschooled without proper documentation. Still, due diligence required a visit. Silas drove out to the Marn residence on a cold Tuesday morning. As he approached the house, an immediate sense of discomfort settled in. The Torture front yard was dead and brown, covered in broken branches and rotting leaves. The mailbox overflowed with uncollected letters, wind chimes made of bones, or something resembling bones, hung from the porch, clinking with the wind in an oddly hollow tone. Silas knocked several times. There was no sound from inside. No footsteps, no shuffling, no voices. Just a thick, pressing silence. He peeked through the window, but the curtains were nailed shut from the inside. He noted the foul smell drifting from somewhere, faint but undeniable, as if something had died nearby. He circled the house and checked the back door. Also locked. He knocked again and announced his presence loudly. Still nothing. Just as he turned to leave, he noticed a small handprint on the inside of the dirty glass near the kitchen. It looked fresh, too clean compared to the grime-coated window it sat on. That's when he knew something wasn't right. Silas filed a formal report, triggering a second visit, this time with backup and the involvement of Child Protective Services. Vaelora had no known relatives, no emergency contacts on record. The school system had received no transfer requests. All signs pointed to something hidden behind those doors. Still, the law required process. A court-approved welfare check was, granted 2 days later. When officers returned, they brought with them a locksmith and 2 social workers. The scene hadn't changed. No lights were on. No one had exited or entered. A neighbour across the street watched from their porch, smoking nervously. They told one of the officers they hadn't seen any of the Marn children outside in months, not even in the yard. One of them recalled hearing chanting late at night, but brushed it off as someone playing strange music. Once the front door was finally unlocked, a blast of stale, rotting air spilled out, thick and heavy. Inside, the house was dark, cluttered and lined with strange symbols drawn in red ink. Or something much worse. What began as a missing child report now looked like the start of something far more disturbing. The silence had meaning. The darkness had purpose. And whatever secrets Vaelora Marn was keeping behind those nailed curtains, the truth was about to come out. What waited inside would shake the entire town of Renslow to its core. The officers who entered the Marn residence that cold morning were prepared for signs of neglect, maybe even abuse. But nothing could have readied them for what they found. The air inside the house was heavy, filled with a mixture of mildew, rot, and something harder to place. Something that seemed unnatural. Dust clung to everything, and every step kicked up clouds that made breathing difficult. The wallpaper had been torn in long, jagged strips, revealing blackened wood beneath. Strange symbols were smeared on the walls, using what initially appeared to be red paint, but as one forensic technician later confirmed, it was dried blood. The living room was sealed tight, its windows covered not just with nailed curtains, but with wooden boards from the inside. Old books with leather covers were stacked high on shelves and the floor. Many had no titles. They were filled with bizarre illustrations, ritual diagrams, lists of names, and pages soaked in unreadable script. The smell became stronger as the team made their way deeper into the house. It led them to a narrow hallway where doors were bolted with steel latches, from the outside, not within. The first door was opened slowly. Inside, a child sat curled in a corner, wrapped in a dirty blanket. Her name, as they would later confirm, was Vaelora Marn, just 7 years old. She didn't speak. She didn't look at them. She had the hollow gaze of someone who had been forgotten by the world. The second and third rooms held 2 boys, Zakai, aged 10, and Brune, aged 12. Both were underweight, their skin pale from lack of sunlight, their clothes torn and stiff with grime. Zakai was shaking, clutching a doll with one missing eye, while Brune sat motionless, staring at the wall. Neither resisted as officers lifted them gently from their rooms. The 4th room revealed Nirel, 13, silent and stoic, but his eyes darted constantly, scanning every face, every movement. There was no sound in the hallway except the shallow breathing of the children and the murmurs of shocked officers. Each room was the same, barren, cold, and windowless. Thin mattresses lay directly on wooden floors, with no sheets or blankets. Empty bowls and rusted cans were stacked in corners. The children had clearly been kept in isolation. They didn't speak to one another or to the officers. Not even eye contact passed between them. The emotional damage was immediately obvious. And yet something else lingered in the house. Something worse. A quick count revealed that 2 children were still missing. Aria, whose absence had triggered the investigation, and Sereth, the oldest, sibling, aged 16. Their rooms were not among the ones discovered upstairs. A further search of the house uncovered another locked door near the kitchen, much more secure than the rest. It had been bolted with 3 large chains and multiple screws drilled deep into the frame. This door led to the basement. Before descending, officers called for backup. They didn't know what to expect, but every step deeper into the home seemed to uncover something more sinister. The basement door was eventually cut open with bolt cutters. Behind it, a narrow staircase descended into darkness. There was no light switch. Officers had to use flashlights. The air became colder, damper, and more rancid the farther they went. What they found at the bottom was a room that could only be described as ritualistic. Symbols, identical to the ones upstairs, covered the floor and walls. A circle had been drawn on the concrete with melted wax. Candles, long since burned out, sat in corners. In the middle of the room was a wooden chair, bolted to the floor, with thick leather straps attached to the armrests. Dried stains surrounded the chair in a dark halo. Officers quickly realized they were standing in what looked like a place of torture or sacrifice. On a nearby shelf sat a row of jars, one of which contained several small, human-looking teeth. Another jar held strands of long, dark hair. A notebook was found beneath the shelf, bound in what appeared to be rawhide. The title, scrawled in jagged letters, read, "The Cleansing." Its pages described strange rituals, instructions, and references to removing impurity from the blood. For now, there were no bodies, but the evidence was overwhelming. Something evil had been taking place inside that house, and with 2 children still unaccounted for, the urgency grew. The investigation was no longer about neglect. It was about uncovering what happened to Arya and Sereth, and whether it was already too late. The deeper investigators dug into the Marn residence, the darker the revelations became. The house was no longer just a scene of neglect. It was something far more disturbing, a place steeped in intentional cruelty and obsession. The basement, which officers initially thought might be used for storage, revealed itself to be a carefully constructed chamber for rituals, unholy acts cloaked in symbols, candles, and cruelty. The chair bolted to the floor, surrounded by dried blood, wasn't part of an old experiment or a forgotten piece of junk. It was a device of torment, designed to restrain and, in all likelihood, hurt. Forensics began working immediately. Samples from the floor, the walls, and the jars were taken to the lab. While this process unfolded, a group of officers focused on what appeared to be Vaelora Marn's private study, an upstairs room hidden behind a bookcase, accessed through a narrow, nearly invisible passage. Inside, the space was unlike any other part of the house. It was immaculately organized. Dozens of journals lined the shelves, sorted by date. On a small desk in the center of the room sat a large leather-bound book titled The Doctrine of the Fleshless Path. The book contained hundreds of pages, each carefully annotated by hand, with underlines, drawings, and symbols that matched those seen throughout the house. It quickly became clear that Vaelora believed in a twisted religious philosophy. The writing spoke of a cleansing, of removing spiritual filth from the bodies of the marked. There were passages describing how children could be born tainted, needing purification through pain, silence, and obedience. One particular page had 6 drawn circles, each with a name written inside: Sereth, Eria, Mila, Zakai, Brune, and Nirel. Next to 2 of the names, Eria and Sereth, was a dark symbol that wasn't present next to the others. Officers speculated it meant those 2 had already undergone the full cleansing, whatever that entailed. A set of drawings found behind the desk revealed even more horror. They depicted disturbing scenes: children strapped to chairs, their eyes blank, surrounded by swirling shapes and flames. Beside these drawings were smaller notations, including phrases like "the 5th was difficult" and "the youngest offered the greatest resistance." The implication was undeniable. The rituals weren't symbolic. They were real, enacted in secret, and executed with chilling precision. In the forensic lab, confirmation came swiftly. The blood found on the basement floor belonged to Vaelora Marn. Her DNA matched samples kept on file from earlier school medical forms. Investigators also confirmed the human teeth in the jar belonged to a child no older than 10. These findings made it increasingly clear that Vaelora had died in that room, yet there was no sign of her body, no burial site, no remains inside the house. Cadaver dogs were brought to the property. They alerted near a tree line behind the house, about 70 feet into the forest. The ground there had been recently disturbed. A team of officers and forensic diggers began excavation and within hours found scorched remnants of what appeared to be a small fire pit. Inside were fragments of bone, cloth, and melted plastic, all later identified as part of a child's remains. This confirmed the worst. Vaelora had been killed and her body burned in an attempt to destroy evidence. But one mystery still remained: Vaelora Marn. Her name had also been marked in the journals, and yet her body was not found, and she had not been seen by any of the neighbours or school staff in over 6 months. While searching for signs of her, an officer noticed a section of the kitchen floor that sounded hollow when stepped on. At first, it was dismissed as old construction. But upon closer inspection, a faint seam could be seen, barely visible beneath the linoleum tiles. Using tools, investigators pried the section open, revealing a wooden trapdoor. The door was bolted shut from the outside with 3 heavy locks. Once opened, a thick wave of cold, damp air rolled upward. A narrow tunnel led down beneath the house into complete darkness. The team descended with flashlights drawn, not knowing what they would find. What they discovered in that crawl space would forever alter the course of the case, and confirm that the horror inside the Marn home had not yet ended. The crawl space beneath the Marn residence was a narrow, claustrophobic tunnel lined with dirt and rotting wood supports. As the officers moved deeper, their flashlights flickered across cobwebs, cracked beams, and insects scattering away from the sudden intrusion of light. The tunnel curved slightly, leading to a cramped underground chamber, barely tall enough to stand in. What they found there was more unsettling than anyone could have anticipated. A makeshift cell constructed from rusted fencing and wooden boards, reinforced with wire and nails. Inside was a filthy mattress, a bucket, and a small wooden crate with scraps of food. In the farthest corner, huddled in the shadows, was a girl. She was thin, her body frail and bruised, and her long hair tangled like a curtain hiding her face. She flinched at the lights, shielding her eyes and trying to back farther into the wall, as if she had become part of the very stone. Officers carefully approached and confirmed what they feared. This was Vaelora Marn, 16 years old, but with the malnourished frame of someone much younger. Her lips were cracked, her skin marked with cuts and scabs, and she made no sound, just wide sunken eyes filled with a mixture of terror and confusion. Vaelora had been kept underground, possibly for months. The crate of food was barely touched, and the mattress was soaked through. She was wrapped in a burlap cloth and wore several necklaces made of bones, which matched similar materials found upstairs. The officers who found her were struck by how lifeless she appeared, not just physically, but emotionally, like a shadow of a person rather than a girl. When she was gently removed from the cell, she didn't resist. She didn't scream or cry. She simply stared ahead, as if her mind had long since left the body. Medical teams rushed her to a hospital, while the rest of the investigation teams stayed behind. The question now wasn't just what had been done to Vaelora. It was why. With Suburban confirmed dead and Vaelora discovered in such a horrific state, investigators began revisiting every piece of evidence in the house. More notes were pulled from the journals in Vaelora's hidden study, and a disturbing theory began to form. The journals referenced Vaelora as the final vessel. According to Vaelora's writings, Vaelora was chosen by the spirits to undergo a transformation, one that required isolation, starvation, and the stripping of all earthly identity. Pages referred to a rite of severance, a ritual that involved removing language, memory, and emotion to make the subject a pure vessel. It was clear Vaelora believed Vaelora was to be used in a final act of devotion. The ritual had not yet been completed, which likely explained why Vaelora was still alive. But if the investigators had arrived just days later, it was possible she would have disappeared like Vaelora, only this time with no trace at all. Despite extensive searches, Vaelora Marn herself was nowhere to be found. She had vanished. There was no sign of a struggle or escape, no travel records, no vehicles registered in her name. Her phone had been turned off weeks earlier, and her bank accounts were untouched. It was as if she had simply dissolved into the shadows. Some officers suspected she had fled during the early stages of the investigation, sensing the walls closing in. Others believed she might have perished in one of her own rituals, perhaps buried somewhere the search had not yet reached. Vaelora remained hospitalized, her condition stabilizing, but her mental state fragile. She had not spoken a word since being found. Psychologists believed she had endured prolonged psychological trauma, possibly worsened by forced isolation and ritual abuse. Efforts were made to locate extended family, but no relatives came forward. The Marn children were officially placed under protective custody, their names changed, and their location sealed from the public. The town of Renslow was left in shock. How such darkness could exist undetected for so long was the question on everyone's mind. Yet the final chapter of the horror inside the Marn house was still to come. Because just when authorities believed the nightmare was over, a letter arrived at the police station, sealed in red wax and signed with a symbol, the same symbol that had been etched into the basement walls. The letter arrived in a plain envelope, unmarked and without postage. It was found on the front steps of the Renslow Police Department early one morning, as officers prepared for another day of piecing together the horrific events at the Marny residence. What caught immediate attention was the crimson wax seal pressed with the same bizarre symbol seen throughout the Marn house, an eye surrounded by a jagged ring of flames. The envelope was opened carefully by the lead investigator, who had grown accustomed to the macabre. But what lay inside chilled even the most seasoned among them. The letter was handwritten in spidery, slanted script. It began with a calm but chilling message: "The world rejects the truth, so the truth will reject the world." It went on to describe the children as vessels unworthy of rebirth, and referenced the sixth awakening, a phrase repeated several times in Vaelora's journals. Though no signature was present, investigators knew immediately. It had been written by Vaelora Marn herself. What terrified them most was the letter's final line: "The work continues, far from your dead lights and blind laws. I am beyond the reach of flesh now." The letter was turned over to forensic experts. Its ink was found to be mixed with animal blood, likely goat or pig, and the parchment was handmade. It matched none of the stationery in the Marn home. This suggested Vaelora had help or access to supplies that indicated her preparation for this disappearance had been long in the making. But more alarming was the implication. She was not working alone. Someone had delivered this letter, and someone was still out there, possibly aiding her. As investigators deepened their probe, they began to uncover a pattern. Vaelora had not always lived in Renslow. In fact, her records appeared to begin just over 18 years ago. Before that, there was nothing. No birth certificate, no school transcripts, no social security number. The name Vaelora Marn was likely an alias. Digging into her past, detectives linked her to a woman who once lived under a different name in a rural commune in Montana. That commune had disbanded following a suspicious fire that claimed the lives of 4 children and 2 adults. No one had been convicted. The survivors had disappeared, scattered under new identities. One of them, investigators now believed, had resurfaced in Renslow. This discovery sparked a much larger investigation into cult activity across several states. The symbols, rituals, and language found in the Marn house closely matched those used by a little-known splinter group of a defunct religious sect known as the Light Beyond Veils. This group had vanished from public knowledge decades ago, but underground communities may have kept its beliefs alive. Vaelora's house, it seemed, had been a shrine, a hidden temple where she continued the old teachings in secret, using her own children as offerings. But what about the children now? Sereth remained under close medical care. In her 3rd week at the psychiatric facility, she finally whispered a single word: Ashen. No one could determine the meaning, but it was a breakthrough. The others, Myla, Zakay, Brune, and Nirel, began responding to therapy slowly. Their behavior remained deeply guarded, their trust broken beyond easy repair. One night, Nirel began drawing in crayon, sketching what looked like a dark forest with a house in the center. Inside the house was a figure with long hair and a circle of fire above her head. He handed the picture to a nurse and walked away without a word. Law enforcement knew that while the physical house had been sealed and declared a crime scene, the true horror, the ideology, was still at large. Vaelora Marn was somewhere out there, possibly rebuilding, possibly recruiting. The Marn house was eventually demolished, but strange visitors began showing up at the lot, leaving flowers, trinkets, even pages from books in strange languages. The site had taken on a life of its own. To this day, no one has seen Vaelora Marn again. But every year, on the anniversary of the first 911 call, the police department receives another letter, each one bearing the same wax seal, each one ending with the same phrase, "The work continues."